Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, Examining Power Dynamics to Advance Systems Change. I'm Jennifer Slansky-Juster, Executive Director of the Collective Impact Forum, and we are delighted to have you here with us today for the fourth of a series of webinars on systems change hosted by FSG, New Profit, and the Collective Impact Forum. Thank you so much for joining us. Before we dive into today's conversation with our guests, I'm just going to spend a few minutes orienting you to the session. Our conversation today will run for about 60 minutes, and we have today's session set to be a casual learning experience where we're going to hear from some outstanding leaders about their work in the field. We'll spend most of our time in conversation, and then we will save some time at the end for Q&A. You can share questions with us in the Q&A box at any point in the webinar, and we'll be monitoring that and turn to questions towards the end. In addition, the session is being recorded, and we'll be making the recording available later on today. Please do keep an eye out for an email with a link announcing the webinar, and you can then access it and share it with others in your network as you are interested. Note that we do have 3 handouts that are loaded into the webinar application, the slides from this, as well as a few different articles and resources on today's topic. So you can find those in the handout box on your screen. So let's go to the next slide here. If you're interested, you can tweet about this. A couple of our handles are here on the screen. And you can, as I said, ask questions using the Q&A box. And you can use that for content-related questions as well as questions related to technical issues that you might be having. So let's go on to the next slide. So without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce today's guests. We have an amazing group of presenters joining us today to talk about one of the essential conditions for achieving systems change, addressing power dynamics. So leading today's discussion, we have Tulaine Montgomery. Tulaine is an accomplished social entrepreneur, educator, community organizer, and writer. She's a managing partner and member of the executive team at New Profit. As a member of the founding team that created New Profit, Tulaine provides strategic and financial support to many of our nation's most promising social innovators. Joining Tulaine in conversation are Adam Foss, Chekemma Fulmore-Townsend, and Simran Sidhu. So Adam Foss is Executive Director of Prosecutor Impact and a former assistant district attorney in the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office in Boston, Massachusetts. Adam is a fierce advocate for criminal justice reform and the importance of the role of the prosecutor in ending mass incarceration. Chekemma Fulmore-Townsend is President and CEO of the Philadelphia Youth Network. Chekemma is an energetic thought leader focused on driving transformation in poverty and inequity for youth and young adults. At PYN, she draws on her experience in research, social work, and systems change to lead the creation of coordinated systems that promote academic achievement, economic opportunity, and personal success. And finally, we have Simran Sidhu, who is the inaugural director of the HIVE at Springpoint, a youth-focused social impact venture founded by Joanna Berwind that supports voice, choice, and opportunity for young people. Prior to the HIVE, Simran served in multiple roles at Youth Build Philadelphia Charter School, including as executive director for 15 years. So thank you so much to all of our guests for being part of today's conversation, and I will hand it over to Tulaine.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. It's really a pleasure to be here with everyone today to talk about something that doesn't often get discussed in open spaces, which is power. And we talked a lot about how we're here on this platform together to really understand what it takes to shift systems and facilitate systems change. So next slide, please. Just to make sure that we're all working with the shared definition of what we mean by systems change. That systems change is all about shifting conditions that hold a problem in place. And that's really important to name at the beginning of our discussion because, you know, when we talk about a problem and really seek to analyze and understand what conditions are holding that problem in place, that's complicated work. And so let's move to the next slide. We'll talk a little bit more about what's underneath that high-level definition. So we talk a lot about systems change as having 6 conditions that hold it in place. A great article called The Water of Systems Change by John Kenya and Peter Senge talks about the 6 conditions. And so actually we're going to put the whole visual up so that quickly I can offer a shared definition. So when we talk about systems change, and those of you who have been joining with us on this series from the beginning, this will be familiar to you. But I do want to just set a shared baseline. We tend to focus at that top tier, that top row when we talk about systems change, policies, practices, resource flows. Those are all critically important conditions and factors. However, we believe that if we really want to change the conditions that hold a problem in place, it's equally important to look at the more implicit aspects of systems change, the things that are harder to name, more complicated to measure, and in some ways that require a greater sacrifice of us as social change and systems change agents. Relationships, power dynamics, and mental models. Now, in previous webinars, we've talked as a group about relationships and mental models, and that's really important work. And so now we're diving into a discussion on power. And what we'll do is hear from some systems change leaders who happen to be based in one great city, Philadelphia, to understand how they've navigated issues and dynamics of power, what they believe power means, what it looks like to shift and share it, and also what it means to really negotiate issues of power in one location. So it's exciting to take that on. Let's go to the next slide. We want to quickly just do a light touch on a very basic kind of meta model for how we're understanding how power operates when we talk about systems change. The National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy talks about power as showing up in 3 distinct ways when we talk about systems change. One is the building of power, and you can see from the image there that building power is all about convening communities, families, students, young people, the people who are meant to be supported by the social sector, but who far too often don't have a decision-making leadership role or not the definers of quality or the assessors of impact. So building power has a lot to do with building, connecting, and convening community. We also talk about wielding power, right? And in that case, we can look at everything from how funders and philanthropy operates when working with systems change leaders. What is the role of government? What is the role of philanthropy? What is the role of those who have been designated or deemed leaders or who have authority and control over some set of resources? So we'll talk a bit about what it looks like when people wield power and have an eye towards equitable systems change. And then the last piece is around sharing power. And you see from the graphic there that that is something we're going to dive into today. What does it really look like to share power? When we had our prep conversations as a team, the panelists and I really wrestled with the notion that's out in our sector about the idea of a zero-sum game. You know, is it really possible when we're advancing equitable well-being to share power? Does someone have to win and does someone have to lose? We're going to get into those discussions a bit in our conversation today. So with no further ado, let's open it up to our panelists. And I'm really thrilled to be here with Chekemma and Simran. And, you know, I have a lot of loved ones in the city of Philadelphia. I'm a big fan of not only the city you're in, but the work that you do. And so let's talk about power. And my first question is, how do you define power? You know, that's a word that can mean many, many different things. What does it mean to you?
Well, power for me is the perceived or real authority or control that one has over another person or a group or community. And I use, you know, real or perceived intentionally because oftentimes we are limited by the perception that someone has power or authority over us. And I do want to challenge those joining us today to remember that sometimes that is the biggest barrier, is the story or the mental model you're holding about being powerless in a relationship, and that there's always an opportunity for you to take back your own control and authority.
Excellent. So Chekemma, we're going to come back to that. Okay, this idea of perceived actual power. I think there's a lot to there to unpack. Simran, what about yourself? How do you define power?
So I think I define it in the simplest way possible, which is just the ability to do or not do something. But I think that I add sort of textural caveats to that, where when I think about power from my lens, and this is both because of the position I'm in and the work I've done, but also maybe because I'm the mother of a 17 and 13-year-old. And so I think of power as both sort of a translation ability, like the ability of someone to translate things and be a translator, and to sort of persuasively corral people around an issue.
Excellent. I love that. And so let's talk a little bit about, Chekemma, you said that there is a tension between perceived and actual. I want you to talk a little bit more about that. I mean, I've certainly observed that there's a tendency to define power almost exclusively by level of capital, the amount of money that an entity or enterprise or person has access to and control over. I hear in your comment that that is problematic. Can you say a little bit more?
Sure. So I think the limitations that you apply to a relationship or a context can be sometimes the most detrimental aspect of your actions, right? It can really limit what you see as options. And I, like Simran, am also a mom, and I think my children have taught me a lot about perceived power. And one would think, like, I'm the parent and I'm in charge. However, they are self-actualizing human beings, and there's quite a bit that I am not in charge of. And I'm amazed at how they've figured that out so quickly, and also have found space and safety in their voice to exert what they can control within their own lives. And I find that oftentimes what is most problematic is the narrative in my mind, right? And so if I approach a situation where there's a power imbalance, there's not to say that there's not imbalances of power, right? There are some times where circumstances, particularly funder relationships, right? Those are ones where there is definitely an imbalance of power and authority. But if I approach that system or that funder and I want to change something, and the first thing that I'm thinking about is how little power I have in that relationship, then I'm defeating myself before I start.
We're going to come back to examples of how we support organizations, communities, people to have that view that you just described, because I'm inclined to agree with you that we have to recognize the various dimensions of power in order to leverage them in ways that advance equity. But if we feel powerless, victimized exclusively, then it can limit our vision for what we can do. So my question now for you is, how does power show up in your work? And this actually is an opportunity to describe a bit and even brag a bit about the ways that you have intentionally wrestled with power issues in the work that you do.
Sorry, are you asking me? It wasn't clear. Or Chekemma?
Yep.
Oh, perfect, great, sorry. So I think I've had the great benefit before I became a funder of being a practitioner, which allowed me to sort of see that relationship from the other side. And what it meant was, I'd had this experience of understanding that while funder power sort of seemed like the thing that would move the needle, it often wasn't. It was the wrong power for systems change. That, what was needed, in fact, was trust power, not just sort of funder power was the wrong currency. And often what would happen was the most sort of system changing or deepest conversation would happen after the funder left the room. And they missed out on sort of what was really happening within a system. And, they were sort of given the very sanitized version of anything, but that meant that they could never really be part of that systems change. And so I think I approached this work as thoughtfully as we could, and sort of with this idea that we should never mistake that power for superpower, that yes, indeed, we've got to name and not be disingenuous, that you bring a tremendous amount of power to the table when you have funding power. But all it means is that you have to work very, very hard to offset that if you really want to be part of the solution. And so for us, we've done a whole bunch of things to think about what that means in each of our actions, both from the way we fund, how long we fund. So for example, we tend to be long-term funders, and we're in it for the full life cycle of system change of whatever we're trying to do, and take that approach. We invest in missions so that, and less in projects, so that, you know, whatever is good for the organization winds up being good for us, instead of like, you didn't focus on this project that I wanted you to do. And it also sort of helped us take a good, long, hard look at how to begin the evaluation conversation, and that would, our first attempt at evaluation would be evaluating ourselves, not grantees, that we should begin with sort of seeing how useful we were to the ecosystem that we funded, and then begin to talk about any other sort of kind of impact evaluation. And that we would focus very diligently on building trust. And that, you know, that meant for a good long time we would have to keep proving ourselves, and that we were okay with that, that we sort of owed that to the part of the ecosystem. And that meant a whole bunch of things, including sort of learning fairly transparently, constantly doing assumption checks to be like, okay, why are we not funding these people? You know, we often find ourselves with an organization that is sort of not meeting our ideas, but we go back to saying, well, if the community is telling us this organization is useful to them, and yet somehow they're not fitting in our box of what a grantee looks like, how do we change our box to then sort of figure out how to be useful to community and purpose? And that often means funding startups, investing very deeply in infrastructure, because many great community organizations aren't structured like everybody else is. Fairly intentionally, we fund organizations of a certain size so that they stay close to what's actually happening at ground level. And you know, leadership is at the table often talking about it. And I'd say we're in the process. We have certainly made mistakes, but I think it's made it richer, the experience for us. And we're trying as much as possible to come to the table to really learn, and also not distance ourselves from learning. So I think there was this idea that, you know, funder learning was like, you go off, we'll fund you, you go do that thing, and then we'll evaluate your learning, and your learning will be our learning. And I think what we're trying to do is sort of define a separate learning for ourselves also, like what are we learning about ourselves as we are doing this, and what needs to keep changing about our role, and how do we stay in the conversation where we're not always walking in the room with how much money we have, but sort of other things that we could bring to the table or help in other ways.
That's great, Simran. So there's a lot in there, right? You talked about building trust power, right, as an alternative form of currency to just capital in dollars, right? You talked about measuring success by level of perceived and experienced usefulness of the funder and philanthropy. And so being evaluated by a third party, and also having community be an evaluator of the funder, which is a dynamic that we actually don't currently see in the marketplace, if you will, for the social sector, right? The source of funding and the delivery of resources is not necessarily, they're not connected in a formal way with community. So you're sort of creating a set of techniques and methods that can help funders and philanthropists address the broken elements of our marketplace in the social sector. I want to come back to a couple of those points, but I understand also our colleague and fellow panelist, Adam Foss, is on the line. And so Adam, welcome. I want to give you the opportunity, if our audio will allow, we'll see, it's a live show. I want to give you the opportunity to tell us your definition of power. We opened by defining what does power mean and look like for us. And so what does power mean to you, Adam, in your work and in your life?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, beautiful. All right. Really, really happy to be here and to be on this call with all of you. Power to me, the definition of power is control and value. I work at the arrowhead of the criminal justice system, at the tip of the spear. And when I think about power, I can't help but think about the system that I work in as perhaps the most prevalent example of people exercising power over the other under the name of the government, enforcing the law and taking people's liberty is I think one of the best examples of the exertion of power. And when I think about it, I think about not just the control, but also the assigned values to who are the people who are in power, how do we value the people that are under the control of that power, what are metrics of success, and what are the outcomes that we're looking for of the exercise of that power. And baked into all of that, I love the diagram that you use from sort of like how we've approached reform in the criminal justice system, which is just another way of trying to divest power from the central authority and divest it into the communities most impacted by it. We've been trying so hard to do that by policies and legislation and sort of that top level, but have done not as good of a job of attacking those two other layers, which to me are about the reassignment of roles, which is good. We've seen it happening in places all over the country, and those relationships are now people who have this mindset going in. But what we have not addressed in the entire power exchange is really getting down to the mental models, the culture behind power, and the belief, the professional and personal beliefs that the divestment of power will be a net gain for everyone. So that's how I think about this topic, and it's something that I'm wrestling with every single day.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you. So what's come up so far, and we're only 2 questions in, are some really rich and important central themes. The importance of building trust has come up repeatedly. Each of the panelists has mentioned this in one way or another. And Simran, you gave some specific examples of trust building strategies that you use at the HIVE as a way, based on your perspective as a philanthropist and funder in the ecosystem. I want to talk a little bit more about trust. Trust is at an all-time low in this country across multiple sectors, right? Lowest levels of trust in our private sector have been documented. Very low levels of trust in our public institutions and government have been documented. I would argue that the social sector, while we certainly have room to build trust, that we actually also have a window of opportunity. We're a little further ahead as a sector when it comes to the level of trust. If we can leverage that, I think we actually have a unique opportunity to advance equity. But it's not easy. You know, it's fraught with barriers to trust building based on institutional histories of racism, class oppression, geographic distance and conflict. There's so many things in our structures, systems, culture, and history that make trust really hard. So I'd love to hear, and Chekemma, let's start with you. I'd love to hear what are the ways that you are, as a systems change leader, actively building trust in your work, in your community.
Well, thank you for that. So the Philadelphia Youth Network, we've been in the business of building systems, which sometimes means we have to transform or reimagine both the roles within a system. We have to be self-critical, right, and think, how are we either adding to the problem or helping to create the problem by our own behavior? Like, we have to be very reflective. And I have found that there's no way around authentic relationships, right? And so for us, a lot of the change happens when we are in true partnership or relationship with those leaders. And what we've seen locally is that power in this community cycles, right? And what I mean by that is, there was once a time when I was in relationship with Simran very differently, and I was funding her work, and some might say that I had power over her. We've always had, I see us as partners, and we've always had partnership. But now she's in a different seat, and our work is no longer tied together by money, but we both share some of the same goals when it comes to young people with voice, with choice. And so I can benefit from new things that she's trying with her grantees. And what I have the ability to do is transport that practice across 56 organizations who support youth employment activities. And what we've seen also is that different same friends, different roles, right? And so renegotiating the depth or the type of relationship or defining those boundaries help to create some space for trust and acknowledging that now, you know, a partner that we used to have who was very integral in the work is now my funder. And I used to be her funder. And we've had to have some real conversations about when are we going to be ourselves, Chekemma, to friend, and when are we going to acknowledge what are the tools we're going to use? How are we going to acknowledge that there needs to be a boundary? And so she knows that when I refer to her as her title, that means I want to access your power and authority. If I use your name, I want you to see Chekemma, and I want the freedom and flexibility to be that. And that's real. And the other thing that I think is really important in building trust, and specifically with the community and young people, youth and young adults, definitely. Transparency. Be who you say you are, and if it's not authentic to them, not only will they be real clear about that either by voting out of your process, so they vote with their feet, or they might give you a piece of their mind, or they might blast you on social media, but you have to be who you say you are, and when you're not consistent in your actions, that speaks volumes to erode trust. And so that is another way that I would say is really critical to building relationships with the community. And that includes being honest about the power or the lack of voice, or where you do have control and where you don't have control, and recognizing that different roles have to be played. So there are some times where I'm very silent on issues. It doesn't mean that I don't agree with the loud person. It just means that strategically I can't be loud. And I often will say to my peers and colleagues, I think it's great that you're about to bring this issue to the table. Here's how my support is going to show up. Here's how it will not, because it's not in keeping with my organization's brand or role identity, or the risks are too great for me. And if I do this, do you have a job lined up for me? Because my people might not, you know. And so to be honest about your boundaries is another place that I think helps to build trust.
So Chekemma, there was a lot of real wisdom in there, and I just want to pull out a couple of themes. You talked about transparency, to walk the talk is another way to say that. You talked about being really explicit about the way that you're interacting with folks like Simran, like Adam, and others who are in your network, where the relationship is steady and the roles may shift, right? So the idea that, you know, you would use Simran's name when it's about talking, you know, sort of bringing the whole, and that her role when it's about leveraging power or resources in service of a stated goal. That's really powerful. And you can only do that if you have relationship, right? You can only come up with those signals and agreed upon cues if there's a deep enough relationship to build that shared language together. What I want to ask is now a little bit about what's hard about building trust, because, you know, we say build trust, be transparent, be authentic. And if it were that straightforward, I think more people would do it, right? So what are the things that get in the way of doing the kind of trust building that you're both describing? And Simran, let's start with you.
Sure. I mean, I absolutely agree with every single thing Chekemma said. I think what gets in the way of it, in some ways, is in the simplest of ways, is the reverse of what she said, right? Like not being an honest broker of people's realities in some ways, and not understanding people's roles. And I think blame, sometimes when you don't sort of understand what people in certain situations can do and sort of blame them, or I think mistaking your power for superpower, right? Like thinking that you alone have this ability to change something, it makes you, act crazy. And I think all of us may have been there for a few seconds, but maybe we're fortunate enough to like catch each other before we go all the way over into believing our own sort of BS on those fronts. I think, it's sort of, it really is back again to the relational front. I think if you cannot be vulnerable about what you can and cannot do, and sort of pretense at perfection or having answers, all of those things get in the way. I think one of the biggest things is an absence of humility in this work, is just the death knell for any kind of real relationship, because I just don't think any of us, as certain as we've had to be in moments when you're sort of leading and standing forward, I think we all sort of deeply know we don't have all the answers. And if you are vulnerable about that and say, here's what I know, what I can't do, what I can do, what I will follow up on no matter what, and are really clear about those things, it's easier. But I think where it falls apart is when you can't do that. And also sometimes it's in the complexity of systems, because Adam and I have actually had this experience too, right? Like you're holding hands tightly and going along, and suddenly one of you gets derailed, and you sort of have this decision point where you're like, do we go on and do the work? Do we wait? Do we, and you sort of have to check in and give each other permission in order to maintain trust as you go forward and take the work forward. And in some ways, what's great about those moments is it's such a great values check moment, right? Because you sort of usually come at it, and Chekemma and I have been in these positions too, where you're like, all right, this is about the work, you do this, I'll do this, and we'll figure it out together.
So that's excellent, Simran. And Adam, are you still with us on audio?
Sure am.
Beautiful. I'd love to hear from you. What gets in the way of trust building? What makes it hard to build trust in your experience with the work that you're doing at Prosecutor Impact?
Yeah, listening to the other to Sam and the other folks on the line, what comes up for me is just, again, running all of this through the filter of the criminal justice system. I measure the efficacy of the criminal justice system on whether victims of crime feel confident picking up the phone. And we know that people who are the most marginalized are the people who are most victimized, and the people who are the most marginalized are also the people who are the most policed and have most contact with the criminal justice system. And so there's a real question about why is it that if they're the most policed and the most contact with the criminal justice system, are they the least safe? And it's because of this breakdown in trust of the system. We know from really, really good work by other nonprofits in the space that victims of crime, over 50% of them will not pick up the telephone because they are afraid of what happens when the police come to their doorstep. They're afraid of that exercise of power. And I think Simran summed it up so well by saying it's the balance between accountability or vulnerability and candor. By being explicit and transparent about what is going to happen, like the consistency behind the exercise of power, and then the vulnerability to say, listen, we know that everything is not perfect, and here's what I can and cannot do, which only comes about by being accountable to yourselves, by tracking things, by collecting data, by having real hard conversations with yourselves. You cannot be vulnerable if you don't allow yourself the openness to have someone tell you you're doing something wrong, taking that feedback as not criticism but as an opportunity to learn. That's really where I see the criminal justice system having failed. I remember coming out of law school and everybody telling me, you're going to the greatest job in the world, you're going to the greatest office in the world, and all we told was, you're great, you're great, you're great. There was never a time, and there's still, it's really hard to get prosecutors in this space to say we're part of the problem. We have the most amount of power in the criminal justice system, and mass incarceration has been happening on our watch. I stood on the front line of mass incarceration, and looking around, it's very difficult to get other folks who did this work to say, yeah, we were part of the problem because we don't have that vulnerability, and as a result, we've lost the ability to have people trust us the way that we could if, to Sim's point, we had a little bit more candor, a little bit more humility, and a lot more vulnerability.
And if I can add to it, I think, like, to name it, and Adam sort of speaking, sort of put it in one word, and there's fear. I think it's fear of the loss or the perceived loss of power, which is very real, I think.
Yes.
Right, as a funder, as a prosecutor, like if you perceive that your only power is something, to have to build a whole new type of power is very, very difficult. I mean, if we're doing long-term funding and working with a group of organizations and we've committed to it, it means at some point we don't have the power to fund new ones, we approach the table then as partners, but it does, in your head, you can start to believe it changes the dynamic so much that you cannot operate in that way. I think a lot of like the year-on-year funding cycle craziness comes from there. And I also think, you know, I think you alluded to this about it being a zero-sum game or not. And I think in some ways, sometimes it is, but it's over time. And I think we all have to understand, like, there is this grappling, but it can be a good grappling with power, that one sometimes takes more power than the others. But without that, we'd be in stasis, is that the word? Yes. And not move forward at all. And if we are trying to change something, it means we're going to do these handoffs every now and then, and relationships, to Chekemma's point, and trust make those handoffs so much easier and smoother, and to be able to say, hey, you know, you've got this, I'm going to go to the background because you're doing this work, and you know, there will be a time when I will have more, but I will hold how you treated me in that, you know, like if we're all good about sharing and how we treat others when we have power, there is less fear when you don't have power, I think.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Please.
And if I could add something, I do think that something that makes trust difficult is risk, right? And who's going to be the first person to show their hand? And I used to have a coach who would say to me, trust is a choice, right? And so if you're telling yourself a story I used to tell myself is if I don't do it myself, it's not going to be done right, right? And so that really translates to, I don't trust you to do it, so I'm going to do it myself. That's a story I'm telling myself. And what am I okay with? Where is the story actually false? And I think the other place is when behavior is inconsistent with, personally, if your behavior is inconsistent with my values, I'm looking for data and information to validate how much trust I can extend to you. And one of the things that I've challenged myself personally to grow is to say, what is it that you're seeing and what are you curious about, and go find more evidence. Because sometimes what you see is not what's happening. I think Simran pointed this out. We kind of judge other people's behaviors. And so I've really tried, I practice this in my mom life. I say to other moms, like, this is a judgment-free zone. And so, you know, you let your kids go to the supermarket in pajamas, knock yourself out. And sometimes I'm like, oh my gosh, what do they have on? And I'm like, that's judging another mom. Stop doing that. So like being really mindful of some of the behaviors that we have come to accept, like in our thinking and how we review others, and challenging yourself to do something different, which sometimes means like you have to be the first risk taker. You got to be the most vulnerable in the room. And that has really shifted the dynamics, because it opens the door for more honest conversation when people see you're willing. Suddenly it's more comfortable for them to be equally vulnerable, or it tells them something different about you, and then the next time, and it builds the space for trust to grow.
So Chekemma, that's excellent, because my next question was going to be, where have you as a systems change leader had to learn something that surprised you, or that was maybe challenging for you, and you actually naturally went there, and I feel like you gave us your answer to that question, though I welcome you adding if there's something more you'd want to say.
You know, I feel like I've faced these sort of growth moments, iron sharpening iron moments on a regular basis, because when you're doing this work, I try to first say to myself, we work specifically with young people and helping them prepare for their future success. And that looks like succeeding in school, but it also looks like, what do you want to do? How do you want to change the world? What do you want to work as? Sometimes that question comes up. And I often say to young people that work readiness is a journey, right? And we kind of approach the way we talk about work like it's this place that's magical, and when they get there, it's going to be great. And the reality is we're all on a work readiness journey. And some days I am not as work ready as others, right? Some days I am late. I did not meet your deadline. I did not negotiate in advance. I am struggling. And other days I am on it. And that is the reality of being a person. And so I try to think of every point of change, like, what am I asking the other person to do? And am I willing to do that, right? And so I really try to do that in my leadership, in my reflection. And sometimes I have to grimace and bite my teeth because I've just asked a question and I'm hoping you say it was great. But if you don't, I need to be okay with that and breathe that in and really reflect on what my behavior is, like inspiring that response. So to recognize that you you're contributing in some way. And that was a huge lesson for me to learn. I call it I'm the master of my own crazy. And so when I'm feeling overwhelmed or overworked, it's like, you put all this stuff on the calendar. You didn't say no. And to own the ownership of your own voice and choice and circumstances can be really eye-opening when you realize that you are actually controlling some of what's bothering you, and start with yourself first.
And Chekemma, that connects, I don't know if you did that intentionally, but it connects beautifully to your opening point about recognizing sources of power beyond capital, money, and position, right? You just described a reflective process by which you are always in honest relationship, for easy or for difficult, with your own personal power over the experience you have in the work you do. And so I just want to name that and connect those dots for people who are on the line with us, because as we talk about these broader themes, I know you're also looking for tools, tactics, and strategies. And you just gave us one really naturally in your response to the question. Adam, what about you? What for you has been a surprise or a learning as you've taken on this work of systems change? We may have lost you for the moment. We'll come back
Nope,
to you.
I'm here. I'm here.
Go for it.
Sorry. I had started in on such a good point, only to find myself on mute.
That's right. It happens. Happens to the best of us.
What has surprised me at how difficult or how greedy people are with their power. I have been so overwhelmingly disappointed in people who have been some of the strongest ambassadors for, again, like criminal justice reform writ large, which for the purpose of this conversation just means shifting power. I have been so disappointed in people who have been the strongest ambassadors for that shift in power when it came time for them to divest some of their own power, or worse yet, having we've touched on like how some people have gained power and build power through other means than capital, just like having airtime and having that charisma and having that attention. That's a brand of power. And when people have received that, to see that get in the way of their stated intentions around the divestment of power and community has been really, really disappointing. And I don't say that as a slight against anybody consciously. I know that a lot of what we're talking about is unconscious. And when we were talking earlier about how this shows up in the work, I was just sitting here thinking about, like, if we sort of like look out from work, if we satellite out from our jobs and think about all power structures, race, gender, all of these things, particularly in this period of time where everybody's woke and everybody's talking about these issues, as soon as you talk to someone about, okay, here's what to do to reframe this power narrative, the first sort of response is like, no, I'm not talking about me. I'm talking about all those other people. I'm a good person. That's someone else. And so what has been such a shock to me is how unprepared people are, not to deal with their conscious awareness about power dynamics and how it breaks down systems, but how little we've spent on getting to the unconscious nuclei of our grasp of this power, and how do we get people to the place where we're not just saying the right things, but we're doing the right things and we're acting commensurately, even when it means, in some cases, taking away from us, which I'm not bought in. That is not an endorsement of the idea that to put power one place means somebody needs to lose power. But when the biggest surprise for me is how difficult this work is and how incremental it is, because you are dealing with human beings that are so much more complicated than their prefrontal cortex and the stuff that comes out of their mouths.
That's right. If we had more time, I would ask you, Adam, how you have dealt with that disappointment. How have you managed and navigated and held the disappointment while still moving forward in the work? I can't put it out there and not give you a chance to give us at least a couple sentences on it. We are in a moment going to open for questions from the group, but I'd imagine that is a question we would get. So give us your kind of Cliff Notes version of how you have managed to hold the disappointment, but still press forward with the vision for system change.
One, I think, again, like, it's just overwhelming empathy. It's just like having to check myself and realizing that these folks are not, they're not struggling for the most part with their conscious belief. They're not being manipulative. They're not lying. They're not being dishonest. They're just not doing the work that someone was talking about earlier, which is about breaking down and becoming vulnerable and dealing with stuff that is uncomfortable. A lot of this just has to do with discomfort and the acknowledgement and admission of things that people don't like to hear. You know, like, I was having a conversation last night about our country, and how bizarre is it that the United States of America is like, we're the strongest country in the world. We have the biggest this and the biggest that. We're number one. And we've been around for an evolutionary blip on the radar in terms of other nations on the planet. And if I were those other nations, I'd be like, who the hell are you? And the only way that we are allowed to do that, the only way that we can show up and celebrate all the big, awesome stuff that we have, our military, our economy, our education, all these things, the only way that we are allowed to celebrate those things in such a short amount of time without doing the requisite work that other nations had to is slavery. Like, we just got like the biggest head start, and nobody wants to. We want to continue talking about our exceptionalism and our grit and our determination, because we cannot become vulnerable enough to say what we have, the power that we are in now, is based upon the genocide of one people, the enslavement of another, and the subjugation of lots of other people. Not because it's a value judgment on any individual walking around right now, but because it's a level of honesty that can get us all moving forward in a different direction.
So I think sounds like honesty, transparency, willingness to sit in the discomfort towards a sort of greater wisdom is the way that you hold the disappointment, which means you got to have relationships, you got to have support, you got to have people who you can talk to about what you're going through. So I see Jennifer is with us, and so it's time for us to open this up for questions from you. And so I hope that if anything has emerged that you would like to dive deeper into or understand more clearly, that you would offer it up now. So Jennifer.
Yeah, we have a host of really excellent and insightful questions, really building on the conversation. And just to the point Adam was foreshadowing, a question that came in was, how does the role of history impact the potential of reconciliation when institutions have traditionally abused power? For example, the abuses of the criminal justice system or a family foundation whose wealth originates from exploited slave labor. So I'm wondering if any of you have any reflections on that point.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this reminds me, it makes me go back to the mental models, right? And, lots of folks talk about the way by which we were able to, as a court-advanced nation, build such an equitable criminal justice system is because we othered an entire segment of our society and decided that they were not fully human and did not have an important role to play as leaders and contributors. And so I do believe that, and this connects to me so beautifully to the points that Adam and Chekemma and Simran were making earlier about building trust. The reason that trust is such an important tactic, right, is because all the systems in history say that we should not trust one another across different identity and different functions in our society. So that to build a trusting relationship across racial identity, across class, across function is frankly a revolutionary act. It's completely counterculture, but it's the only thing that will get us to a new reality in terms of systems change. So I do believe it's important to, one, know the history, to Adam's point, to pretend the history didn't exist or it was oh so long ago that it no longer matters. Neither of those approaches will serve us. We have to be willing to look eyes wide open at the fairly brutal history that's also part of the success of this nation, and then build deep relationships in the ways that my panelists have already described so beautifully. That's my initial thought.
Great. Thanks, Tulaine. A question for the group. So the idea of vulnerability certainly came up several times throughout the conversation. And people are wondering if you have any advice on how practitioners can build a more open and vulnerable relationship with funders. And is there a way to suss out or identify if being vulnerable will be well received in a certain situation? So I'd love to hear maybe a practitioner perspective on that and a funder perspective on that.
Simran, yeah, why don't you jump in?
Sure. I'll start with sort of the funder, and I haven't been a practitioner for 3 years, and I'm reminded of that I no longer get to, put that hat on when I feel like it, because it's been enough time. And, I do think that it is back to sort of broaching with openness and sort of asking about people's realities sometimes, because I think that many practitioners see funders as sort of this monolithic power, sometimes for very good reasons, right? For all of the reasons that we talked about. But the truth is we have our vulnerabilities, our realities, our limitations, our humanness, but also just the structures in which we are set up, I think sometimes are not as well understood. I remember as a practitioner sort of sometimes thinking that there was this magical visit and a magical proposal, and it went off and then came back. And I think, Chekemma was one of the few funders I think that we built sort of authentic relationship with. And that was partly because of a shared set of realities too, right? Like in some ways we had another funder in common. But I think sort of coming up to funders and flipping questions. I think practitioners are not in the habit of asking funders questions and saying, so what are your realities? And what am I really helping you with? And what would you like alerts on? And where do you want to be invited to learn about sort of the reality of what we're dealing with? And look, I can write you a report if that's what you need for your board and your sort of paperwork, but would you like to really learn about this stuff? And may I introduce you to some people? I think so much of the sort of perceived social capital feels like it sits with funders, and we have convenings and we have these things, but I wish sometimes it would get flipped on its head, because frankly, funders could stand to be in places where we are not sort of, the horde, and instead are sort of really looking at complexity and immersing ourselves in it with intention. And, I would ask funders, like, how can we help you be your integrity meters? Because they are needed. It is so easy in this work to talk a good game. I mean, we are all at risk of it. I have been there. I have done those things. And, the things that pull you back from that sort of space of safety where you're likely to do the knee-jerk, terrible systems thing is, sort of having enough integrity people around you with whom you have shared. Let's have a shared understanding of our relationship. And I think that conversation should be able to be started from either side. Like, what do we owe each other in this? I think clarifies some of it, and not over-promising on either side, to Chekemma's point, I think really can help with that.
Chekemma, do you want to add to that? You're sort of that's from the practitioners.
Well, yeah, I was shaking my head a lot because I agree with Simran. I think the other piece is setting metrics for yourself, right? Like, if the goal was for you to be honest and transparent and candid, and that doesn't lead to an additional check or more money, or sometimes it actually leads to somebody taking you money. If you were actually transparent and candid, then you've actually achieved the result. It just has some consequences for that risk that you have. Maybe you anticipated it, maybe you didn't. And so oftentimes, really, I ask myself, do I want to be right or do I want results? And then I have to get really clear about what those results are in those circumstances. And then when I am feeling more emotional, I have to say to myself, well, name the emotion. So last week I had a rough week as a leader, and I was like, I by 10 o'clock on Thursday, after working on something all day that I should not have been working on, I was angry. And I try to really avoid anger because I'm an Aries, and that's probably not a great space for me. And the next day I woke up and I was like, okay, what do we know about anger? Anger is hurt's bodyguard. So what you really are is hurt. What are you hurt about? I'm disappointed because, I'm trying to produce excellence and I didn't meet the goal. I'm disappointed in myself because I put my trust in the wrong place and I didn't seek or check evidence. I'm disappointed in the people who didn't deliver for me. Okay, now what do you want to do? Because to react out of those emotions will lead to a place that is not going to actually get you the result, which is excellent product. So I want to address my concerns. I want to set the course, right? Like, this is what we're going to do to get to the place. And then we're going to come back and revisit this because I don't want to repeat this. But that's some of the, I think sometimes when you look at vulnerability or changing the dynamics, you really do have to say, what is the result I'm seeking? And if it is really to be honest about your limitations or the barriers that you're facing with a funder, then you have to ask for that permission and try to create that space for you to do that. And then circle back, right? I think sometimes when you unload in a new way, it's like, whoa, what are they doing? Circle back to say, I know I left a lot with you, and I was really curious about how you're perceiving that and what impressions you got. And then be quiet. Let the person talk and you receive it so that you can know how to, adjust your course.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Chekemma. I think that in the interest of time, we're going to have to make that our last question today. I want to offer an opportunity to Tulaine, if there's anything you'd like to say in closing to wrap us up before I just share some parting, more housekeeping notes.
Sure, absolutely. Well, in closing, appreciation and gratitude, right? I do think that systems change does require that we really lift up the things that we have to be grateful for in the work. And I'm so grateful for the opportunity to, be part of a conversation with the three of you. You're doing such incredible work in a place that matters a lot to me and beyond that place. And the way you're working and leading and teaching is really powerful. So I think the main closing point is appreciation and thank you for not only the work you're doing, but the clarity with which you articulate the tools you're using to stay the course. And so building trust, authentic relationship, transparency, accountability, reflectiveness. These are all traits and techniques that you all are using to lead powerfully in the world and change systems. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Adam.
Wonderful. Thank you all. And, on behalf of FSG, the Forum, and New Profit, we are just so lucky to have had all of you, and Adam also, who we can't see here in front of us on the line as well. We often get asked questions about more concrete tools and resources on the topics that we cover, so we wanted to provide just a few links here for folks on the topic of power. We will also share these in a post-webinar email, and these are in the slides if you downloaded them as well. So these are tools to be recommended. Let's go to the next slide. And so finally, before we want to wrap up, I just want to remind everyone that we will be sharing a recording of this session. And for anyone that's interested in going deeper on these and other topics related to systems change, one upcoming opportunity would be to join us in Pittsburgh in October for the Collective Impact Forum's Champions for Change event. We would love to see you and be able to go deeper for 3 days on which we scratch the surface of here for just an hour. So in closing, I will just say thank you to all of you for joining us today and wish everyone a great rest of the day. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Bye.